Hi, everyone. Welcome to Both Sides of the Story, PBS 12's high school debate tournament. I'm your host, Alan Genevieve from CBS 4. Thank you for joining us. It is a big night. Tonight is the debate we have been waiting for all season, the championship of our 2020 tournament. We've seen 11 great debates this fall, and tonight, our 12th debate will determine the champion of our newly expanded format. On tonight's program, students from George Washington High School in Denver and Cherry Creek High School in South Denver compete for the title. So let's meet our participants now. First up, Katie Jack. She's a junior at George Washington High. Let's meet Katie.
My name's Katie Jack, and I'm a junior at George Washington High School. One of my favorite moments in debate was probably participating in the online nationals tournament this year. I had a team that I was debating with, and we all got to talk about these really important issues, and it was just with people who also cared about them a lot. So it was a really powerful experience for me. Debate's really important right now because it teaches young people how to use their voices in order to stand up for something that they believe in. And I think that's really important in light of this pandemic and also in light of the Black Lives Matter movement and other important social movements that are pushing for progress and change. And the way that those two things come is by young people and people of all ages being able to speak up for what they believe in. And speech and debate directly teaches individuals how to do that.
Every time I see her on one of our Google Meet calls, she's so happy and so enthusiastic that I feel I can be happy and enthusiastic as well. And we're going to get through this.
Now, you've met our competitor number one, Katie Jack, also Genevieve Holliday, a senior at Cherry Creek High School in Denver. Let's hear Genevieve's story.
My name is Genevieve Holliday. I am a senior in high school, and I go to Cherry Creek High School. I've been debating for a little over 3 years now. I started as a freshman. Outside of debate, I enjoy tap dancing, skiing, and I'm very involved in my school community. A few months ago, I finished writing my first draft of a novel, and I'm editing that right now, and I hope to get that published in the future. I would like to thank my mom for always being there to support me, and of course the wonderful Miss Benham, our debate coach, and also the very knowledgeable Tom Pippin.
Genevieve is astounding. She's an amazing young woman with a brilliant mind and a kind heart. She's very compassionate. She reaches out to her peers and helps others when they're needed, and she loves to learn new things.
Genevieve Holliday, also a number one level competitor. These are the best in the state, folks. Also joining us is our special panel of experts who will offer their analysis of the debate. They are Dominic Dezzutti, host of Colorado Decides, the election debate series produced in conjunction with CBS 4. He's joined by Penfield Tate, a longtime state lawmaker and attorney with Tate Law, and Eric Sonderman, political analyst and a columnist with Colorado Politics. Good to see you, Eric.
Can't wait. Glad to be here, Alan.
Going to be a tough one, Eric. Here we go. Time to set the ground rules. Each side will present their case, ask each other questions, and have a chance to offer rebuttals. When it's finished, we'll go to our illustrious panel for their own questions, and we'll find out whom they felt offered the best argument. So let's get started. The issue up for debate in this final round is this: is the Electoral College the best way to elect the President of the United States? Let's have our coin flip and we'll get things underway. Katie, I'm going to let you make the call. Heads or tails?
Heads.
Heads, and you get to make the choice. Katie, what would you like?
I'll do affirmative, please.
Okay, Katie is the proponent during this round, and Genevieve has the negative. So right now, Katie, the floor is yours for 3 minutes to get things started. Go ahead.
All right. I stand in firm affirmation and believe that the Electoral College is the best way to elect the President of the United States. Contention 1. The Electoral College ensures that all parts of the country have a say in selecting the President. According to Electoral Vote Map in 2020, the Electoral College is integral to America's Federalist philosophy. Federalism involves diffusion of powers among federal, state, and local governments, rather than a strong central government. The Electoral College is enshrined in the U.S. Constitution, but states are allowed to determine how electors are selected. Small states and large states have their say in each presidential election based on each state's popular vote. According to Guizlo in 2018, the Electoral College forces candidates to appeal to a wide range of voters. A direct national popular vote would incentivize campaigns to focus almost exclusively on densely populated urban areas. Clinton's popular vote edge in 2016 arose from Democratic voting in just two places, Los Angeles and Chicago. Without the need to win the electoral votes of Ohio, Florida, and Pennsylvania, few candidates would bother to campaign there. Essentially, the Electoral College ensures that people's interests are fairly represented in government, regardless of their geographic location. Contention 2. The Electoral College helps avoid uncertainty about the outcome of an election for three main reasons. The first, removing the Electoral College would result in more widespread voter suppression and fraud. According to Spillerman in 2020, a change in election rules will stimulate behavioral adaptations by the political parties to the new electoral environment. At present, in one-party states where the winner of the presidential contest is not in doubt, there is little motivation for the dominant party to inflate its vote count. But if the electoral decision were determined by the national popular vote, the calculus would change, since it would no longer matter where a vote is cast. Indeed, this would heighten the attractiveness of odious, if marginally legal strategies that have sprung up in recent years with the objective of diminishing voter turnout, such as the exclusion of felons, burdensome identification laws, and challenges to mail-in voting. If the electorate decision were based on the national popular vote, we can expect such laws, along with outright vote tampering, to be instituted more extensively, especially in states dominated by a single political party, since the institutional arrangements for ensuring a fair contest are weakest in such settings. Additionally, the Electoral College prevents the possibility of a nationwide recount. According to Spillerman in 2020, the system prevents utter electoral chaos every time the popular vote is close nationwide. By partitioning the popular vote among 51 constituencies, the Electoral College structure serves to restrict vote recounts in close elections to very few states, just the ones that are closely divided in the popular tally and have sufficient electoral votes to affect the outcome. Lastly, the Electoral College prevents the possibility of someone winning the presidential election with a small plurality of votes. According to Guizlo in 2018, the Electoral College reduces the likelihood that third-party candidates will garner enough votes to make it onto the electoral scoreboard. Without the Electoral College, there would be no effective break on the number of viable presidential candidates. Abolish it, and it would not be difficult to imagine a scenario in which a field of dozens of micro-candidates, the winner would only need 10% of the vote and would represent less than 5% of the electorate. Presidents elected with smaller and smaller pluralities would only aggravate the sense that the executive branch governs without a real electoral mandate. For these reasons, I stand in firm affirmation.
Katie, Jack, thank you very much. Now, Genevieve Holliday, you have 2 minutes for any questions in cross-examination. Go.
All right. So is it fair that under the Electoral College, a candidate can win the popular vote and yet still lose the presidency?
It is fair because the college was established so that people with different interests are represented fairly, which means that rural voters have the same amount of influence as people that live in urban areas. Because if we just looked at the popular vote, these rural voters would not have very much influence because they would live in less populated areas. But we do see that most of the time the Electoral College results and the popular votes coincide.
All right. So you mentioned that the Electoral College encourages presidential candidates to campaign in more states, but doesn't it actually force them to look at just battleground states as opposed to campaigning all over the place?
No, they definitely don't just look at battleground states. And then looking at the Guizlo evidence, what I was talking about there is how the Electoral College forces candidates to appeal to a wider range of voters. So if we just looked at the popular vote, people would just campaign in areas that are densely populated and urban. And this means that the opinions of people in rural areas around the country are going to be excluded because they're not needed in order to win the vote. Whereas the Electoral College makes sure that we need the people from all over the country in order to determine the outcome.
Okay, so why would there still be an incentive for third-party candidates to run in a popular vote as opposed to the Electoral College? Like, what is the difference there?
It's not really an incentive for them to run. It's more of the possibility of a scenario in which you could have a ton of different candidates and then one gets elected because they have the majority of the votes, but it's just a small majority. So the evidence that I talked about there from Guizlo talked about how there could be a 10% of the vote somebody could win, and then they would become president of the United States under a popular vote system. And then that just aggravates the sense that the executive branch is governing without actual confirmation.
All right, we're going to have to end the questions right there. Genevieve, the floor is now yours to make your case in the negative for 3 minutes. Go ahead.
I negate that the Electoral College is the best way to elect the President of the United States for three main reasons. The Electoral College no longer aligns with our values, it unfairly distributes power, and it undermines democracy. My first point is that the Electoral College no longer aligns with our values. The Electoral College was originally created for two main reasons. The framers of the Constitution distrusted the direct vote of the people, and they wanted to extend the power of the South. Political science professor Scott Lameau at the College of St. Rose writes that the Electoral College reflected the belief of many framers that the excess democracy shown by state legislatures needed to be curtailed. Additionally, when our nation was founded, slaves could not vote and yet were counted as 3/5 of a person in order to apportion more electoral power to southern states. Today, these two original reasons no longer align with our modern values, and there is no reason to continue the use of the Electoral College. My second point is that the Electoral College unevenly distributes power. The Electoral College doesn't account for hyper-urbanization or enormous population disparities, thus giving a disproportionate amount of power to small and swing states. According to the National Journal, the founders never envisioned a behemoth state like California. In their day, the population difference between the largest and smallest state was 10-1, Virginia versus Delaware. Additionally, cities were minuscule. What's worse is that this shortcoming of the Electoral College gives a disproportionate amount of power to swing states, especially small ones. The New York Times editorial board states that a Wyoming resident's vote counts 3.6 times as much as a Californian's. And because almost all states use a winners-take-all system, the election ends up being fought in just a dozen or so battleground states, leaving tens of millions of Americans on the sidelines. This skewed representation also contributes to the silencing of the voices of racial minorities. The Yale Law Journal cites the Electoral College as a source of disenfranchisement for minority voters. The winner-take-all setup of the Electoral College, combined with minorities often living in more highly populated areas, means that minority votes are not weighted as much as they should be. This is a failure on the part of America to fully represent the voices of its people. My third point is that the Electoral College undermines equality and democracy. According to the New York Times, by overwhelming majorities, Americans would prefer to elect the president by direct popular vote, not filtered through the antiquated mechanism of the Electoral College. They understand on a gut level the basic fairness of awarding the nation's highest office on the same basis as every other elected office, to the person who gets the most votes. Indeed, 2 out of the last 3 presidents have lost the popular vote while still winning the election, with 5 such presidents existing in total. Remarkably, in 2016, despite losing the presidency, Hillary Clinton beat President Trump by more than 2.8 million votes, or 2.1% of the electorate. That's a wider margin than 10 winning candidates enjoyed. Thus, because it has aged poorly, it unfairly distributes power, and it harms democracy, the Electoral College should not be our means for electing our president.
Genevieve, Holliday, thank you very much. Is the Electoral College the best way to elect the President of the United States? Genevieve in the negative, Katie in the positive. 2 minutes for questions. Katie, right now, go ahead.
Okay. Would you agree that the Electoral College helps establish and maintain a system of federalism within the United States?
I do not agree because we have other systems such as the Senate and the House set up for federalism, whereas the Electoral College is no longer necessary to do so. And I believe that since every single other election in the United States is decided based on popular vote, there is no reason to also not decide the president based on the will of the people rather than the Electoral College.
Okay. Do you have a problem, for instance, with all states being able to have 2 senators within Congress?
No, not with the Senate. However, the idea that if the Senate is legitimate, then so is the Electoral College doesn't really flow through because senators themselves still are elected via the popular vote, whereas the Electoral College isn't actually representative of the popular vote.
Okay. Do you think that if we were to switch to a system of using the popular vote, that rural voters would be disenfranchised since they don't have as much say anymore?
I don't believe so because you still have a one person, one vote mandate rather than a person in Wyoming, their vote counting 3.6 times as much as someone in California. So we're simply making it fair by having one person having the equivalent of one vote. And those people in more rural states or smaller states still have a say in the Senate and through other means in our democracy.
Okay, so how do you feel about the system within Maine and Nebraska where they distribute electoral votes differently instead of a winner-takes-all system?
Right, so that is perhaps a bit more fair than the Electoral College itself, but the issue is that's only 2 states, and almost every single other state or every single other state besides those 2 in America does not use that and instead uses winner takes all, and that leads to racial minorities being disenfranchised through the Electoral College.
But it is still...
All right, we're going to have to cut it off right there because that ends that round of questions right now. As the affirmative, now, Katie, you have 2 minutes for a rebuttal. Go ahead.
Okay. All right, so I'm going to start by just going down my opponent's case. So first of all, she talks about how the Electoral College is not consistent with our current values. And one value that I do want to discuss involves my first contention that talks about how the United States was founded with this principle of federalism. And so that's discussing how people from different areas of the country and all areas of the country should be able to have a say in the national government, and that the national government does not become extremely strong and centralized. And so the Electoral College makes sure that people from rural areas who do come from smaller populations are able to have a say within the election. If we were to eliminate this, they simply would not anymore because they'd be outnumbered by people in urban areas that have completely different interests. What's important here is that we need to make sure that people's interests are represented fairly. And so I would argue that is a big value within our country, and it's absolutely a constitutional value, and there's not necessarily any sort of constitutional reason that we should switch to a popular vote when we see that the Electoral College is working in order to make sure that things are fair. And so she's talking about how it was created because of distrust with the people, and then how they wanted to expand the power of people in the South. And again, obviously, I don't agree with the values of the people who lived in the South at that time, but we need to consider the current state of our country, and that people in rural areas do have different interests than people in urban areas, and their interests would be completely outweighed if we just switched to a popular vote. So then moving on to her second point, she talks about how it unevenly distributes power, and it gives power to small states and swing states. It gives power to these states because in another situation where we switch to the popular vote, these people wouldn't have power at all. So that's talking about my Guizzo evidence for my first contention that talks about how Clinton's popular vote edge came from Los Angeles and Chicago. She wouldn't have even needed Ohio, Florida, or Pennsylvania in order to win under a popular vote system. And so that's extremely important because that means that these states wouldn't have much power at all, whereas people in urban areas do still have power under the Electoral College system. Her third point is how it undermines equality, how people want to have the popular vote. But what's important here is that the Electoral College makes sure that people's interests are accurately represented, and for this reason, it should be continued.
The championship round of both sides of the story for 2020 with Katie Jack from George Washington High School and Genevieve Holliday from Cherry Creek High School. Genevieve, 3 minutes to respond and close. Go.
All right, so I'm going to start by going over my opponent's case. First, she mentions that the Electoral College forces the president to pay attention to all states. However, actually, the result is that they pay too much attention to swing in small states and not enough to any other region, which they would under the popular vote. This is a result of the winner-takes-all system that almost all of the states use. Vox states that the bias comes in two ways, with swing states and small states. For example, it didn't matter whether Clinton would win New York by a 30% margin or a 10% margin, because she would get the same amount of electoral votes either way. However, just getting 0.1% of the vote, winning by 0.1% of the vote in Florida matters so much to these presidential candidates, because 29 electoral votes could flip. So what you see is that you're looking at these battleground states, these swing states that have such a small margin that matters so much. And additionally, with the small state bias, 4% of the country's population in the smallest states ends up being allotted 8% of Electoral College votes. So what you see is that there's an extreme bias to these smaller and these swing states, whereas as opposed to campaigning all over the country, presidential candidates stick to just these battleground states, and they stay mostly in those places and focus on only those interests, especially before the election. Additionally, in my opponent's second contention, they say that it helps avoid uncertainty and that you would get more widespread voter fraud under a popular vote. But if you look at every single other election in this country, you don't see in the status quo this widespread voter fraud extremely inhibiting the functions of the Senate or the House. And so the issue is you actually won't get this disenfranchisement on a large level under the popular vote. You'd actually enfranchise more people because more people's voice matters more. And then finally, my opponent mentions that it prevents someone from winning without a plurality in her third contention. But the problem is, actually, the Electoral College, according to the Washington Post, encourages third parties, especially those with regional bases, because by winning a few states, they may deny either major party candidate a majority of the electoral vote. You can come in third and still win a prize. However, under the popular vote, if you are to run as a third-party candidate, it won't work in the same way, and you're actually disincentivized more under a popular vote. And what you see is that the Electoral College is just inherently unfair because it gives it doesn't follow the principle of one person, one vote, as does every single other election in this country. Because when you look at places such as Wyoming, their votes matter 3.6 times as much as someone in California. And this is simply because the Electoral College is outdated and it doesn't account for hyper-urbanization. As you look now in California, there's a 50-to-1 ratio as opposed to the 10-to-1 ratio between the size of states, and thus I must negate this resolution.
Genevieve Holliday wrapping up her arguments. Finally, Katie Jack, you have 1 minute to close. Go right ahead.
Okay, so just going over the things my opponent said within her last speech. In response to my first contention, she says that the president is paying too much attention to swing states, and this is because of a winner-takes-all system. So I just want to bring up this thing that we discussed in cross-examination, which is that in Maine and Nebraska, they have a system where 2 electoral votes reflect the majority of the state's presidential ballots, and the rest are chosen by congressional district. And so this is a system that exists within 2 states under the current Electoral College that we have within the United States. There's not a reason why it couldn't be implemented more widely if you see situations where there's this imbalance with the number of people who are voting and the number of votes that are being used for the Electoral College. And so this system exists within the Electoral College. It's a valid possibility. But what we can't do is just switch to a popular vote, which would cause all the problems that I talk about within my second contention, most specifically the one about voter suppression and fraud. She says we can look at other elections, but other elections aren't nationwide. The presidential election having to be recounted or including more voter suppression and fraud would be a very bad impact, and that comes from switching to a popular vote.
12 debates. It all comes down to this one, your championship round on both sides of the story. Let's go to our panel of experts right now and get their thoughts on what they saw. Dominic?
You know, Ellen, anytime you have a tournament format, you get to the title bout and you hope that it lives up to the hype. And I had very high hopes for this one, and they have all been exceeded. Katie, Genevieve, you offered us a fantastic debate. Anytime anyone asks why we do this series, I'm just going to show them what you both just did, and I would win that argument every day of the week. Our job is not done. You're going to get questions, some quick questions from both Penfield and from Eric Penn. Your first question for Katie.
Great. And ladies, I agree with Dominic. You have done a wonderful job. Thank you for giving me the opportunity to be here with you. Katie, based on what you indicated with regard to Maine and Nebraska, if we keep the Electoral College as you maintain, should Electoral College votes be reallocated and recalculated as and among the various states?
I think that's a really good question, and that's something that should be debated. But like the question in today's resolution is talking about, like, is the Electoral College best, or should we switch to another form like the popular vote? And so we absolutely should maintain the Electoral College for the reasons that I provide in my first and my second contention. But yeah, I could see improvement by switching to a system that Maine and Nebraska have, because it does solve some of the problems that my opponent talks about within her case. And then the important thing to mention is that neither system is going to be absolutely perfect. We're deciding which one is best. And the Electoral College is best because it avoids all the negative impacts of my second contention and also maintains this system of federalism. There can be improvements made within the system, and that's proven by the examples of Maine and Nebraska.
Eric, your question for Katie.
Yeah, I would just echo that. I think we saw very clearly why both of you are the finalists. Katie, all of the momentum in this country over decades and decades has been in the direction of one person, one vote. Why shouldn't that concept, that principle, also apply to the election of president? Why should one vote in Pennsylvania, or Wyoming for that matter, be worth more than one vote in California?
So again, everybody does have their vote within the United States. And so there is still, everybody has the option, they have that power. The reason why you see this weight placed on people in rural areas is because people in rural areas and people in urban areas have very different interests because of their geographical location, because of their beliefs. And so the people in rural areas are automatically going to be discounted because there's fewer of them, because it's a less populated area. The Electoral College makes sure that their interests are just as represented as people in urban areas, and it does this by the way that they structured it. And so this makes sure that we have the system of federalism that was enshrined in the Constitution. And really, there's no constitutional reason to remove this and switch to a popular vote when we see all the negative impacts I discussed in my second contention.
Genevieve, it's your turn. Penn, your question for Genevieve.
Sure, Genevieve, I am curious about your contention that going to a popular vote would discourage third-party candidates. Many believe that the problem we have now is that we only have two major political parties. Why should we shift to a system that limits the number of different voices that can be brought forward by political parties?
Right. So I would say that that's a bit of a separate issue than the Electoral College, because the winner-takes-all system we have right now can be fixed through other means, such as ranked choice voting and things along those lines. But if you look at the Electoral College versus the popular vote, the Electoral College ultimately, yes, third parties will run, but they won't actually win regardless of whether they are in the Electoral College or under a popular vote. And I'd say that there are other means that we need to look at to encourage third parties if that is the route we want to go down. But I'd say ultimately, if you look at which system is best, you see more positive aspects of the popular vote than you do the Electoral College.
Eric, it's your turn. What's your question for Genevieve?
Yes, for Genevieve, I think you'd agree so much of the power in this country these days is already concentrated along the coast. Technological power, financial power, cultural power, you name it. Wouldn't your prescription really even further shift power that direction, further marginalize smaller towns, rural states, etc.? And is that what we should be doing at the moment?
So I don't think so, because if you look at states, according to Vox, or not at states, at presidential candidates, they don't really campaign in rural areas regardless. Even when they're going to smaller states, they are still campaigning in the cities there. And so they're not focusing entirely on rural issues to begin with. But even when you look at the popular vote, you still get presidents throughout history from both parties that want to focus on rural interests. And it's simply not feasible for a president to only pay attention to the coast and get all of the votes there. Like, regardless of popular vote or Electoral College, presidents still need to garner more votes than just highly populated areas. And just this setup of our country in general ensures that all of these voices are heard.
Ellen, you're going to give us a few minutes while Eric, Penn, and I make the big decision on this championship match.
That is a tough job. We're going to give our panel a moment to consider whom they felt won this debate. That'll give me a moment to let you know tonight's debate wraps up our 2020 tournament. These are the finals. If you missed any of the debates this season, be sure and go to pbs12.org. Check out the past episodes. We've covered a lot of issues important to Colorado, and we've featured some of the best high school debaters in our state. Okay, panel, good luck to you on this decision, Dominic.
My favorite part of this is as we're getting answers, Eric's remotely, I've got Penn right here, and I have Eric's answer. I look at Penn, and you just see him looking literally at both sides, just weighing this out. That's where all of us were. Katie and Genevieve, you both did a fantastic job. Really, really great work. Our job is to name a champion. I wish we could do a dual championship. That is not our style. In a very narrow split decision, I may say, Genevieve, the title goes to you. Congratulations.
Thank you.
Alan, back to you.
Genevieve, Holliday, and Katie Jack, you did your schools proud. Thanks a lot. And congratulations for winning our 2020 championship. You have given our viewers quite a bit to look at. It's all the time we have for our program tonight. I want to thank our excellent students for accepting our challenge and for participating in our debate. I also want to thank our esteemed panel for sharing their thoughts and making that tough decision. Finally, we want to thank you for tuning in. It's the support of viewers like you and our sponsors that helps to make this show a reality. You can catch up on past episodes of this program on pbs12.org. You can catch me on CBS 4. And for everyone here at PBS 12, I'm Alan Janae. Thanks for watching this season. That is Both Sides of the Story.